So last week we had a message from Reverend Kevin Ross, an outstanding message, and he brought up the idea of the commandment that the master teacher gave us to love one another, that it wasn't a suggestion, that it was a commandment. Love one another. And Reverend Brandon in our opening said, we commit to having our consciousness expanded this morning. So are we committed to those two things, to loving one another and having our consciousness expanded and looking at ourselves as well as the world among us and the world around us to see what is here for us, what is here for our awakening and our expansion? So there are examples throughout history of how when we fail to reach this commandment, when we fail to actualize it, we engage in destruction of biblical proportions. And how when we just seek to fulfill this commandment to love one another, we harmonize. We make a space on this planet where we can have more peace, where we can have more love, where we can have more growth. But what does that really look like, and how do we get there? What are the baby steps? What are the pieces of awareness for each one of us to dive into in order to look at how we're living in our lives and how we might be contributing to the problem or contributing to the solution? In Unity, we teach that our practice is about looking at our minds, our thoughts, our words, our actions, our emotions, and how those co-create our reality. Also, we're taught to look at our perceptions and our perspectives, to really look at them and to be responsible for them, to be accountable for them. So I've heard a lot of people lately, I mean, you always hear people saying this, but more lately, I've heard a lot of people saying that they don't really like people. You know, I like animals. I prefer animals to people. I don't really like humans. I don't really like other people. I don't really like our species. And that's a problem, isn't it? It's a problem that we are challenged by our own species, and we're challenged by humans. The master teacher taught our worthiness. He taught that there is a space within each one of us where we are united, where we are whole, where we are complete, where we are perfection, really, where we are love itself in expression. And so that's what we're here to dive into today. We're diving into what, as Imelda Shanklin says in the book, What Are You? What we are. But we're diving into this quote from her. She said, evolution halts or hastens in you. Evolution halts or hastens in you. So we've seen what happens when people become polarized. We've seen what happens when we take our differences and we turn them into conflicts and we make them drive us apart. We've seen that throughout history. We can look at the history of countries and see how people got an idea of other and began filtering everything through that idea and created an impasse, created a space where there was no conversation, there was no room for growth, there was no room for reconciliation, there was no room for healing. And so, what can we do right now with the condition of the world, the condition in the United States of America, the global condition, and the condition within ourselves? What can we do now to make sure that we take different steps, that we are born from new actions and we are born into the activity of new paradigms that will create different results? Imelda Shanklin in her book also says this when she's talking about ancestors, and she's saying that it's not as important, you know, your ancestry of your grandfather, what your grandfather did, as it is about what your grandson is doing. But she, in this conversation about history and ancestry, she says this: mental ancestry is a necessity. In all vital ways, you are your own ancestor. What you were in former times has produced the you of today. The you of today begets the you of tomorrow. To improve the product, the you of today must transcend the you of yesterday. So that applies to each of us as an individual, as individuals, and also as a collective. We can look at what has happened in the past and what it has created, and the dangers of what the past has created. And in fact, right now, it is a perfect time to be looking at this, because we are on the Easter walk right now. We are in the Lent season. We are in that time of introspection and growth on the path of awakening, where we look at not just what happened years ago, but what is happening right now and what it can bring to us today. We're on this journey of the lessons, the awakening, the crucifixion, the resurrection. We're on this Easter walk, and it holds an opportunity for each of us to be present to evolving, or be present to halting evolution. What is ours today, collectively and individually, to look at, as far as allowing our evolution to quicken within us. On this week's AG&T Speaks conversation, I had the Rev Deborah Johnson, who serves out in California, and she's on our AG&T Association for Global New Thought Leadership Council. And she always does an amazing job speaking to polarization and speaking to what's happening in these times, and how a shift in perspective, how an opening of our heart can draw us into the future rather than stick us in the past and recreating the past. So she has done a lot of work. She has a history as a mediator and conflict resolution. And so she brings that conversation to us this week. I want to share this clip.
And I've been doing a lot lately on not only inclusion, but on how do we stand in the oneness in the midst of all of this. One of the things that I noticed is that with this so-called divide, particularly the blue, the red, that there's a tremendous amount of othering going on. Othering is when you have this sense of there's us and them, that somehow or another there's this mutual exclusivity between us. There's a tendency to dehumanize, where they're not even like really people anymore. It's the this, the that, like the homeless, you know, those conservative, the liberals. And with that, we start to lose sight of each other's humanity. That was something that Martin Luther King Jr. used to always warn us about. He said that too often we trade in the I-thou relationship for an I-it relationship, where it's like we aren't even dealing with people anymore. And just one of the words of encouragement that I would like to give right now is that I think to really make it through these times, we have to develop an expanded consciousness that allows paradox to exist. Let me explain what I mean when I say that. A paradox is when there are seemingly opposite things that are both simultaneously true. And I know that gets to be a challenge sometimes on the spiritual journey. You know, people will say something like, well, be sure and get clear, you know, do your vision board. And then somebody else will say, well, don't have too much attachment, you know, surrender and let it go. And you're like, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to really affirm specifically, or am I supposed to just be with anything? And the answer is E, like all of the above, all of the above, and learning how to do the balance with that.
So this idea that we can draw ourselves into division and into polarization because we look at one aspect of things, or we hold tight to one interpretation, one experience, is an idea that does not engage our wholeness. It does not honor our wholeness, the fullness that we are. And so we're called, each one of us, to look at how we are viewing our world, both the internal world and the external world. Because the conflict, she says, is caused not so much by the differences. The differences are fine. The conflict is caused by the polarization. It's sitting in the differences and making them matter so much. In fact, making them the viewfinders or the glasses or the lenses through which everything else is experienced. Hear that. Making the differences, the lenses through which everything else is experienced. No good can come from that, but it is a fault of the human condition and an experience of the human condition that we try to do that, and sometimes inadvertently do that. The challenge, she says, is to get ourselves not to polarize from each other because of our differences. Because when we do that, we're no longer listening. We're filtering everything through the one label, and we all do that, don't we? I was just talking to someone this week, getting support with an issue that I was working through. And when describing this relationship, I gave a label. I gave kind of like a little sound bite. And then went on to explain the rest of it. And my beloved called me on it. And she said, that's one thing you're going to need to look at letting go of, because no good can come through that. No good can come through. Every time this comes up, you define it like this and then press everything else through that conversation. That limits. And what that actually does is it reduces us to labels, ideas, and opinions, rather than our true nature, rather than our humanity and our divinity. So what are we all doing probably that's not very helpful in these days? And we're seeing it a lot. We're seeing it a lot outside of ourselves. So it'll be very easy to go, I know where that's happening out here. What's going to be the challenge is going to be to really look at where is that going on in here. So the idea that we may dramatize, dehumanize, or demonize. Dramatize, dehumanize, and demonize. When we do this, it causes unnecessary unrest. And in fact, we discredit ourselves. And when we dramatize things, we discredit ourselves because it's not grounded. We're not grounded when we're dramatizing things. We're not in our center. And when we dehumanize and when we demonize, we deny the human condition. We deny our wholeness, and we can't quite do that on the external with other people without actually having some of that residual in here, because it's the lens through which we're looking. So it gets into very, very difficult territory when we go from dramatizing, dehumanizing, and demonizing into, I want to stop something from happening. I want to stop something outside of me from happening. So I want to stop it so badly that I need to demonize it, that I need to classify it in this way or that way, because I have to do whatever it takes to make it go away. And that's a problem when it's people. That's a problem when it's humanity. And Reverend Deborah went on to talk about what is America. And she said, we have all these ideas that we want to say, well, this is America, but that's not America, or this is not American, and we're not showing up as we should. And she said, we are all of it. We are all of this. We are the ugliness and we are the greatness. And the same is true within ourselves. We are the darkness and we are the light. We have all of these tendencies within us, each one of us. And if we have to demonize it on the outside, we will demonize it on the inside. But what happens when we dehumanize and demonize people, and when we dramatize things, is that we get into a dark place. We get into a dark place and we're not living our presence and we're not living our truth. Because it is not the truth of any one person that they are all one thing, that they're all bad. It is not the truth of any one person that they are all good, only good in expression in this human condition. It gets into dangerous territory when people start to lean into the idea that says, I want to stop you from living your life. I want to stop your existence. That's the danger. That's what happens when we feed these thoughts, when we don't evolve past these patterns of the human condition and these thoughts of dramatizing, dehumanizing, and demonizing. And we may think, oh, dramatizing, well, how bad is that? How bad is that? Well, it leads to these other things. It leads to engaging the world, not from a place of presence and principle, but a place of polarization and separation. You know, Reverend Deborah was talking about later in the Zoom room, we get to have some up close and personal time. And she was saying that she was once on a debate panel with another woman, and they were talking about marriage equality. That was the topic. And she was on the side of marriage equality, and they were discussing their points. And she was saying the core difference between us, other than that we just have opinions, is that you want to silence me. The core difference is that you want to silence me. Sometimes the fear of otherness, of othering, the fear that can come up is people wanting to stop, kill, or silence others. You know, I think it's interesting this year, and this is just something to do a little meditation on, but Martin Luther King, his Memorial Day this year is Easter. Isn't that interesting that this year it coincides exactly with Easter Sunday, and a year where we are faced with our own evolution as a species of what's happening in the heart of humanity. Martin Luther King taught a great idea. It was that we're all whole and we're all worthy and we're all equal. That idea was taught by the master teacher. That idea has been shared by many throughout time. And it is still an idea that threatens people. It is still an idea that takes people into a space where they begin to say, I want you to stop living your life. I want to stop your existence. I want to silence you. Because I don't want other people somehow to get that idea. See, when an idea has a life of its own, when it's based on truth and principle, it sometimes scares people if other people are comfortable benefiting from the limitation of that idea. Oddly, that seems to happen when progress is right in the midst of us, when evolution is actually hastening among us. Truth has light to it, magnetism to it, both in the time of Jesus Christ and that Christ consciousness walk through Easter that we celebrate this time of year, and today. At that time, there were attempts to dramatize his teaching. There were attempts to dehumanize and to demonize. It's part of the human condition to enter into those ideas. Jesus spoke to people's wholeness, to equality, to their worthiness. He would say something and it would go viral and everyone would be up in a bunch about it. He would stir up controversy for people who were comfortable with what they believed about how the world works. He disturbed people who benefited from the structures and the systems of the times. He taught about the Great Awakening and about the path. And he knew that you didn't have to actually destroy all the systems to have evolution. You just had to speak to the wholeness and the light within all beings and draw it forth. That if you would continue to teach about the worthiness, if you would continue to look past the errors, not always excusing them, but to look through them to the truth of one's being, you could call forth the light in the most radiant way that it could not be taken away by any systems or structures. That in fact, the systems and structures that would evolve would come from this birth of this light within. The new ones would match the concept of worthiness, equality, and wholeness. Because if people know this truth about themselves, they're free. And so there was a drive to silence that conversation, to silence that voice, to silence the part that says, you don't need an intermediary. You can get the truth yourself. You have wisdom within you. I was just recently watching the movie, The United States, or The People of United States of America versus Billie Holiday, that film. And, you know, she was speaking to higher truths. She sang her songs that people expected her to sing, but she had that song, Strange Fruit. And the story goes into what she dealt with and how she was treated and how she lived and died because of the stand that she took to keep singing that song. That singing that song was a threat. And the government wanted to silence her for it because there was such danger in it. And that song and her taking a stand for humanity's divinity and wholeness and equality is the reason why Billie Holiday died handcuffed to a hospital bed and Judy Garland didn't. It's that big of a threat. So what do we do with that today? Somehow really allowing people, encouraging people, and supporting people in thinking for themselves is a threat. But we do it anyway. In Unity, the Fillmores always taught, especially when working with young ones, they taught that you don't need to press ideas into them, that you just need to draw the truth out of them. So what is for each one of us to do? Because we can certainly very easily look at the world around us and say, I can see how this is happening. I can see how things are being dramatized. I can see how people are dehumanizing and demonizing others. And it's terrible, it's awful. But can we look at how we do it in ourselves? Can we look at the thoughts in our own minds and really take inventory of what is created in our minds? Can we let go of the need or desire to silence someone and look through what we don't like to the humanity, to the opportunity for growth, to what else is there, to the whole picture, to the history? The master teacher taught us to listen within and taught everyone to go within, to know your source. Can we know that source of all of humanity, even in the midst of some of the ugliness that we see? Can we look for signs of the 3 Ds within ourselves and in our conversations? Can we really catch ourselves? If we're on the brink of dramatizing something, can we call it back and ask, what would the mindful conversation look like? What would awareness look like here? What would healing look like here? And step back from the desire, conscious or unconscious, to dramatize. Can we look at our own mind's ability to dehumanize others on any level? To say they're less than a full person, or they're not deserving, or they're not capable, they don't belong, they're not part of the whole. When we dramatize, we leave out reality. When we dehumanize, we leave out our humanity. And when we demonize, we leave out our divinity. We're here to build up our divinity. We're here to honor our humanity. And we're here to co-create a world that works for all. That doesn't mean a world that's the same, but it means a world that's whole. A world where we can see the truth of one's being, even in the midst of an appearance that we may dislike. So it's for each one of us to ask ourselves, will evolution halt or hasten within us? When we ask ourselves that question, we'll have the answer to what it will do among us. Namaste.